Sean Ryan on the show a couple months ago. He was amazing, former Navy SEAL. And he tweeted out this picture of himself with the combat paint on his face. And the caption is, "This is a photo of me not being Tim Walz. Some of us answered the call, and some of us, Tim Walz, cowered in the rear." Then there's Sean Parnell, who had run for Senate in Pennsylvania a couple years ago. Same picture of himself with his guns. "This is a photo of me not being."
This started like a normal political clip, and then it suddenly stopped feeling normal. Somewhere between confidence and uncertainty, the moment slipped into pure confusion, words coming fast while the reasoning fell apart, and the internet leaned closer to their screens. There was no shouting, no big performance, just a calm sentence that landed like a verbal sledgehammer and left people blinking. How did it escalate so fast? And why is everyone replaying those same 5 seconds? Let's talk about it.
Trump and J.D. Vance have a manual too. It's called Project 2025, and it's a way to stick it to the middle class while giving tax cuts to the wealthiest. Look, they didn't give me a manual for this if you didn't plan on using it to fix your truck. They didn't create that Project 2025 just to have it set around as a doorstop.
According to the LA Times, this kind of car sells for anywhere between $39,000 to $59,000. So he's just a regular working class guy with a $60,000 automobile. He's just like you.
The internet has a unique way of reminding some politicians that confidence doesn't always mean competence. Tim Walz found that out the hard way when Megyn Kelly took his carefully managed public image and turned it into a moment people online couldn't stop talking about. A highlight reel of comedy he never intended to create.
Just simple on this. You commit fraud in Minnesota, you're going to prison. I don't care what color you are, what religion you are. Anybody who wants to help us in that, we welcome that. But setting on the sidelines and throwing out accusations, and let's be very clear, demonizing an entire population and lying to people about the safety and security of this state is beneath that.
And meanwhile, state Senate Republicans say the fraud in Minnesota.
What made the moment so entertaining wasn't anger or loud voices, but the clear difference in preparation. One side showed up with focus and structure, while the other seemed to rely on confidence alone, carrying the unmistakable feeling of someone who thought good vibes would handle most of the work.
What is the truth about Minnesota governor and now Democratic vice presidential pick, Tim Walz, and his military service record? Questions have been swirling, including allegations that Mr. Walz abandoned his fellow troops in their greatest time of need. Even claims of stolen valor. Yesterday on this program, I spoke with a Minnesota National Guard veteran who has been sounding the alarm on this story for years.
It might surprise you to learn that Tim Walz has spent years perfecting the skill of sounding reassuring without really saying anything that demands commitment. A style that usually works well in friendly settings where people nod along instead of asking tough questions.
Me not being Tim Walz. These guys get it, and they are not going to be spun by Morning Joe saying, "Oh, there's nothing to this. This is like," you tell it to these brave guys who put on their uniforms, grabbed their guns, and actually risked their lives and saw their buddies die in the theater that he quit on as his unit went.
Unfortunately for him, this time the story drifted into Megyn Kelly's orbit, where comfortable vagueness tends to get closely examined. What followed didn't feel like a dramatic clash, but more like a careful step-by-step unraveling. Less an argument and more like watching someone talk themselves into a corner they didn't realize was there. Megyn Kelly never had to raise her voice or create a scene, because the situation spoke for itself. Tim Walz's comments carried the confidence of someone used to hearing applause, but that confidence faded once even basic questions were applied. That's always a dangerous mix when your message depends on never being challenged by reality. Each point he relied on sounded solid at first, until it had to stand on its own, and then it started to wobble like a folding chair that looked stronger than it really was.
Allegations. For what it's worth, the Harris-Walz campaign and the complicit media would have you believe this entire controversy is just a bunch of nonsense. But today we're going to bring you the receipts. Here's what we know. Days after the September 11th, 2001 attack on our nation, Mr. Walz re-enlisted in the National Guard for a 6-year commitment. He would later claim it was only 4. Alpha News, they're in Minnesota, they've obtained the paperwork. It was 6. So I don't know why he's misleading about that. But he signed up to stay in until 2007. 2007, not
The humor of the moment grew quickly, as it became clear that Tim Walz's approach leaned more on expectation than on real substance. He seemed to believe that repeating a point could replace actually explaining it, which is a risky strategy unless the audience has agreed not to question anything. Megyn Kelly, though, has never been known for going along with that kind of quiet acceptance, and she treated every unclear claim like a loose thread that needed to be pulled. What followed wasn't a loud confrontation, but a slow and steady unraveling that felt almost precise in how it happened. Megyn Kelly revealed contradictions simply by letting them sit in the open, which is often the easiest way for weak logic to fall apart on its own. Tim Walz's ideas didn't collapse because they were attacked harshly, but because they were asked to stay consistent, which turned out to be much harder than expected. The humor came from watching confidence try to outrun preparation and fail again and again. His explanations grew longer but somehow less clear, creating that familiar political moment where more talking leads to less understanding. It felt like watching someone try to solve a math problem by adding extra numbers until the answer sounded good, even if it no longer matched reality.
for Tim Walz on the disastrous performance he delivered, in particular when it comes to his self-described knuckle-headed behavior, which was just his latest in a series of lies. The reason he resorted to, I'm a knucklehead, was he got confronted with his latest lie that's been unearthed. There's a long list of them. This one was that he was in China when the Tiananmen Square disaster unfolded.
Megyn Kelly's role in this moment was almost unfair because she didn't have to exaggerate or add anything. She simply let the gaps in Tim Walz's reasoning show themselves, and in this case, honesty did most of the work. With every passing second, the contrast between her calm composure and his growing confusion became sharper, turning what could have been a forgettable clip into a viral lesson on why overestimating your own intellect can backfire. Tim Walz seemed determined to assert authority through tone alone, a tactic that only works when no one questions the numbers. Unfortunately for him, Megyn Kelly's method was all about checking the numbers, rechecking them, and then calmly pointing out why they didn't add up. The imbalance made it clear which side had actually prepared for questions and which side had just prepared for agreement. The scene grew even more entertaining as Walz's confidence began to wobble under the weight of his own assumptions. His statements leaned heavily on implied points, but those ideas crumbled as soon as they were treated like real positions instead of decorative talking points. Megyn Kelly didn't need to call him out. She just let the contradictions line up on their own.
In late 2003, he deployed with his unit to Italy in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. Operation Enduring Freedom is also known as the war in Afghanistan. He never went to Afghanistan. He never saw active combat, nor was he part of Enduring Freedom. Again, that name is used for the war in Afghanistan. He was in a support role in Italy. In the military, these words matter.
At this point, the situation shifted from political commentary into something closer to unintentional satire. Every time Tim Walz tried to clarify, it only made the lack of clarity more obvious, creating a cycle where each explanation needed another just to stay afloat. Watching it felt like seeing someone insist they had a plan while frantically Googling what a plan actually looks like. Megyn Kelly's calm control made the contrast even sharper. She never rushed, never flinched, and never gloated, which somehow made the gaps in his reasoning stand out even more. Tim Walz's confidence slowly slipped into defensiveness, and defensiveness rarely looks convincing when it's masquerading as certainty. The internet noticed immediately because nothing spreads faster online than the moment authority collapses under its own weight. Clips circulated not because of drama or shouting, but because people couldn't look away from the precise second confidence met reality and failed. The reactions weren't outrage so much as collective disbelief at how avoidable the whole thing had been. What made the takedown so effective was its efficiency. Megyn Kelly didn't wander, digress, or let the conversation drift into vague generalities. Every point was pulled back to clarity, and every pivot was gently redirected to substance. Meanwhile, Tim Walz looked more and more trapped by his own setup, unable to backtrack without contradicting himself, yet unable to move forward without exposing yet another weakness.
You know whether you are in a place where hundreds of people are being massacred by their government when it happens. But he continues to try to say, like, oh, gee, I was just kind of confused. that happened in May and I was there in August, but I guess I just imagined that I was there, whatever. So he got asked about that debate moment where he completely melted down on Wednesday in Pennsylvania, and here's how he handled it.
Look, I have my dates wrong. I was in Hong Kong and China in 1989.
The humor reached its peak when it became clear that Tim Walz genuinely thought he was doing well. That misplaced confidence stayed strong even as his arguments crumbled in plain sight, creating a layer of dramatic irony no writer could have scripted better. Megyn Kelly didn't need to intervene because the gap between perception and reality was doing all the work. By the later moments, the outcome was obvious, and everything that followed felt more like confirmation than suspense. Tim Walz's narrative had been thoroughly tested and failed, while Megyn Kelly's approach shone precisely because she never relied on theatrics. The whole episode felt like a masterclass in dismantling a position without ever seeming hostile. As expected, the aftermath played out online. Commentators dissected every moment, and viewers replayed it again and again, both for insight and entertainment. Tim Walz's performance became a reference point, not for being uniquely bad, but because it perfectly showed what happens when assumptions replace preparation. And through it all, Megyn Kelly remained the calm constant, the person who didn't need to dominate the conversation, because she knew how to let weak ideas defeat themselves.
You've got Tim Walz. Okay, Jen Psaki, she's a talking head, whatever. But Tim Walz was recently the vice presidential candidate on the Democratic ticket. Maybe you'd expect a little better, a little higher in terms of the rhetoric. You would be disappointed. Here is SOT 27.
You get up in the morning and you doom scroll through things, and although I will say this, the last few days you woke up thinking there might be news. Just saying.
In the end, the roast worked so well because it never felt forced. The humor came naturally from the gap between confidence and competence, and the takedown landed because it trusted the audience to follow along. Megyn Kelly didn't need to shout or make a scene, and Tim Walz didn't implode in a dramatic way. Yet the effect was unmistakable. This wasn't a battle of personalities or a shouting match. It was a one-sided lesson in what happens when polished words meet careful scrutiny. Tim Walz walked in expecting familiarity to carry him, and Megyn Kelly made sure that familiarity was replaced with accountability. The internet laughed, not out of cruelty, but because the irony was impossible to miss. By the end, the takeaway was clear. Confidence is not armor, repetition is not proof, and charm doesn't survive contact with preparation. Megyn Kelly left the room calm and composed, while Tim Walz became a cautionary example destined to be replayed far longer than he expected. What made it even harsher was how effortlessly the imbalance sustained itself. There was never a moment where he regained control or slowed his own unraveling. His public persona, usually propped up by friendly interpretations and generous framing, suddenly had to stand on its own. Without that safety net, it became obvious just how much he had relied on an audience willing to fill in the gaps for him.
Send Tim Walz out there to be sort of man of the people. And the latest effort was him this weekend, like working on his car. He's just like a guy who works on the car and kicks the engine around.
Everything works on here, except one thing I'm still tinkering with, cruise control. So I'm going to show you how to fix that. At the same time, we talk about creating an opportunity economy so that everybody can get the opportunity to thrive. To be able to work on this thing, you got a manual. It shows you exactly what to do to fix things on it.
Here's the surprising part. Megyn Kelly's effectiveness came from knowing that overexposure is often the best way to take down overconfidence. She let Tim Walz's ideas play out fully, understanding that the longer they stayed in the open, the harder it would be to ignore their flaws. This turned the whole moment into a slow burn roast, where the punchline appeared naturally instead of being hammered home. The more Tim Walz tried to defend himself, the more he looked like someone running from a shadow while insisting it wasn't following him. Every effort to appear credible only highlighted how much of his argument relied on implication rather than real structure. His explanations grew increasingly abstract, drifting from accountability into rhetorical fog, a dangerous place when clarity is the standard. Megyn Kelly's calm restraint made the contrast even sharper. She wasn't trying to dominate or win a spectacle. She was focused on coherence, the most unforgiving measure of all. Once removed from his usual echo chamber, Tim Walz's messaging struggled to hold up under basic scrutiny, and the struggle was visible enough to make the audience wince.
Be news sometime, just so you know, there will be news.
Look at him. So chipper. Don't worry, there will be news. In other words, Trump will die. Something to look forward to. The absolute nerve, especially with a president who was subjected to at least 2 assassination attempts and just dodged death in recent history, to the great relief of every sane person in the nation. Now to be openly, talking about what a delicious day it's going to be.
The roast hit even harder as the audience started to see just how much of Tim Walz's authority relied on the assumption that no one would pause long enough to notice the cracks. Megyn Kelly deliberately slowed things down, not to humiliate him, but to examine each claim as it came. That careful scrutiny stripped away the polished performance, leaving a structure that simply couldn't hold up. The irony was sharp as Tim Walz tried to project calm while clearly recalculating in real time. That recalculation didn't show adaptability, it revealed how little planning had gone into facing a real challenge. Megyn Kelly didn't corner him aggressively, yet he managed to trap himself with over-explaining and contradicting his own points. As clips spread online, the moment took on symbolic weight, reflecting a broader frustration with rhetoric that leans on tone instead of substance. Viewers weren't reacting because of any personal dislike, but because the scene felt familiar. The universal experience of watching confidence crumble when it has to justify itself without applause as a shield. By the end, the lesson was unavoidable. Megyn Kelly showed that intellectual pressure doesn't need volume to work, and Tim Walz proved that certainty without preparation is a liability, not a strength. The roast landed perfectly because it was never announced, never forced, and never exaggerated. It simply unfolded, letting contrast do the work and irony deliver the final blow with surgical precision.